started.
Coke. Like some? Good evening, and welcome back to our continuing series on our prayers. And we are now focusing on the morning blessings. These are the blessings that we recite in conjunction with the experiences that we have upon awakening. First, we thank God for awakening. We have our soul back after sleep. And we thank God for our bodily functions. In general, the fact that our body functions properly, this is what we thank God for every time we use the facilities. Our plumbing is in good order. Then we thank God for the soul. After having gone through the body, the soul, and being alive in general, we get a little bit more specific. Last week we discussed the first of the blessings, which is thanking God for giving the rooster, according to one translation, and the heart, according to another translation, the understanding to distinguish between day and night. When we wake up in the morning, we're grateful that we have the ability to know that it's the morning. We have an alarm clock. And we explained that, of course, it means something much more than just knowing the difference between day and night in the physical sense, but it means to know the difference between day and night in the spiritual sense. And it's important that we review that point because it's going to tie in directly to the next blessing that we're going to be discussing tonight. Day and night are symbols for good and evil. Day is when the sun shines, it's bright, things are clear. Night is a time of confusion, a time of darkness, obviously, and it's a symbol for the negatives. And very often, we are guilty of what the prophet, I believe Isaiah says, we turn light into darkness and darkness into light. Maimonides, when he describes spiritual illnesses, he says it's very much like physical illness in some cases where the patient eats food that's sweet and to him it's bitter, or if it's bitter he thinks it's sweet. We confuse our value system, and that's very much the current situation, unfortunately, in society in many places, where things that were once regarded as really serious breaches of morality are now considered to be absolutely acceptable. Things that used to be acceptable are now becoming controversial and even regarded as being unethical. And I don't want to go into giving specifics, but that is a reality, unfortunately, that we're seeing more and more of these days. And therefore, when we know that we're going in the right direction, and we know what day is, and we know what night is, that deserves recognition, and we should be grateful to God that we have that insight, that we know the difference between right and wrong. Okay, so now that we have the understanding, we know the difference between right and wrong, we go to the next blessing. Blessed are you, God our God, King of the universe. That's the typical and standard opening to every blessing. And as we explained in previous classes, the blessing is not just praising God, but it's channeling God's energy into this specific area that we will be referring to at the end of the blessing. And here, the end of the blessing, it reads, who gives sight to the blind, or opens up the eyes of the blind. Pretty simple blessing, straightforward. When we're asleep, we don't see, our eyes don't function. We might dream, but that's not using the physical property of the eye. When we wake up, we're now able to see things. So we're grateful that we have the power of sight. Now, of course, we already thanked God for the power of sight yesterday and the day before and the day before and the day before. So couldn't we just thank God once that we're capable of seeing, and then that would cover us for the rest of our lives? Why do we have to do it every morning? But the answer is very simple. We should never take things for granted. Just because our vision remains stable and constant doesn't mean that it had to be that way. Unfortunately, tragically, there are people who lose their sight and lose their ability to see physically. We'll get into the spiritual part as we go on. But even in the physical sense, you can never take any of your bodily functions, of your health, any aspect of your health for granted. You have to be mindful of the gift of good health every single day, and not just in the very general sense, but also in the specific sense as well, in terms of our ability to see things. Now, it just occurred to me as I'm talking about this, there is no blessing for hearing. Why don't we thank God that we're able to hear? So a simple answer might be, and this is being developed as I'm speaking, the simple answer might be that these blessings are said by an individual regardless of whether there is someone else around. You say these blessings. Every person wakes up in the morning, they open their eyes, they sit up in bed, they get up, they get dressed, and so on and so forth. You don't need a partner, you don't need another person. But hearing, you have to have someone else there. Seeing, you have to see where your clothing is, you have to see where the bed is and where the floor is. So you benefit from the sight immediately. Hearing, you have to go out into the street. Of course, if a person is married and they have their spouse there, that's different. But these blessings were designed even for an individual who doesn't necessarily have the experience of hearing, and therefore they don't make reference to it. That's an adequate explanation, perhaps, but it still wouldn't hurt if at some point we would have a blessing for hearing. And perhaps the answer to that is that we do have a blessing for hearing, and that's the first blessing. Because when we say that God gives understanding very often in Jewish classic works is associated with hearing. The same word for hearing, Shema, also means understand, because the typical way of us understanding something is by learning from a teacher. In order to learn from a teacher, of course, you can always have sign language, but the classic and the standard way of transmitting knowledge is by a teacher speaking to the student. So he has to hear the words of the teacher, and by hearing it, he understands it. That gives him the ability to understand. So it's the same word for hearing it is an understanding. And therefore, when we thank God for giving us understanding, implicit in that is also the ability to hear. So we don't make direct reference to hearing because we're not really hearing when we wake up in the morning. There's no need for hearing. But we are implying it and alluding to it perhaps when we thank God for understanding. But this needs a little bit more research. The question just occurred to me, so I'll have to try to see if anyone else asks the question and gives any answer to it. Be that as it may, we're now focusing for the moment on our ability to see, and we cannot take it for granted. Question has been raised, what about a blind person who doesn't have the ability to see? One opinion says, therefore he wouldn't say the blessing. It would be almost mockery for a person who's blind to thank God for vision. Others say that the blessing is not for your own personal vision, it's for the fact that vision does exist. It's only that your personal vision alerts you to the reality that there is such a thing called sight in the rest of the world. Now, in the first blessing, we speak about the rooster crowing. Simple explanation is that we're thanking God that we have this rooster that can wake us up. For that, you need to hear, which goes back to what I was saying before, that hearing is implicit in that blessing. So how come they don't ask the question about a deaf person, could he say the first blessing about the rooster? And the answer is very simple. It doesn't mention hearing explicitly. It talks about the understanding. The deaf person has as much understanding as a person who is able to hear. At any rate, what's very interesting is that the first person to recite this blessing, that God opens up the eyes of the blind, was Joseph. There's a fascinating story of the Talmud. We know that Joseph was in the house of Potiphar, the Egyptian minister who employed Joseph as his servant, as his slave. And when no one was at home, Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. The Talmud says something very interesting. I'll just read some of it because it's very, very interesting. That if someone says, I can't really study Torah because I was so distracted by my impulses, by my desires, I was so preoccupied with fulfilling my temptations that I didn't have the time or the ability to learn. So that person is told, could you think that you're better than Joseph? Joseph had much greater temptation, or the possibility of temptation, than you could ever have, and he withstood the test. So don't use that as an excuse. And then the Talmud goes on, this is mentioned in the Talmud and in the Midrash in many places, that it was said about Joseph that every day Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. She put on different clothing in the morning and different clothing in the evening. She propositioned him, and he said no. So she threatened him. She said, I'm going to lock you up in prison. So he said, God releases the bound. He frees prisoners. I will bend your stature, because God raises up the stature of those who are bent. I will blind your eyes. And Joseph said, God opens up the eyes of the blind. And it goes on to describe the way she tried to threaten him to submit. At any rate, the first person to say these words, that God opens up the eyes of the blind, was Joseph, which is the transition to the next part of this discussion. That is the spiritual idea of opening eyes. There's a deeper meaning, as is always the case, that when we thank God for opening our eyes, we're talking about opening the eyes in a different way as well. In the blessing that we just spoke about, giving understanding, to understand the difference between day and night, between good and evil, right and wrong, understanding is not enough. You can understand something, it's logical, it's rational, and you could still go against your own understanding. Because understanding doesn't give you a vivid exposure to that which you understand. It's only approximation. It's not the same thing as seeing. You know, there's an expression in English, seeing is believing. When you see something, that which you see becomes so real that it's etched on in your psyche, on your memory, in your memory, on your psyche, and it becomes a part of you. You cannot compare seeing something to hearing and understanding something. The Talmud actually uses that phrase in a legal context. You're a judge, and you are walking down the street and you see someone committing a crime. So you're a witness to the crime. And the next day or the next week, the criminal who was then apprehended is brought before the judge, and you're the presiding judge. You have to recuse yourself. Not in every case, but in capital cases for sure. Why do you have to recuse yourself? Because you saw the crime. So what if you saw the crime? Then it's even better. The evidence is so much more convincing when you saw it with your own eyes. That's precisely why you can't be a judge, because a judge in Jewish law is also like the defender and the prosecutor combined. A judge in Jewish law, and especially in a capital case, has to be on both sides. He has to serve as a prosecutor and as a defender. If you saw the crime, you can't be a defender. You're not going to be able to find a way of mounting a equally strong defense as much as you can mount a strong case for prosecution. So you have to recuse yourself. You cannot be the judge. Even if you don't recuse yourself, you cannot be the judge. So the question is, why? The judge is going to hear witnesses testify to the crime in the case where the judge doesn't see it, and he knows the witnesses are the most reliable people, impeccable character. They're cross-examined thoroughly, and every word that they say is proven to be true. We can't do anything to discredit their testimony. So the judge is convinced that the crime was committed, but still, since he didn't see it, since it's only what he hears and understands, he could always shoot something through it, through the evidence, and to find a reason for defense. And it goes even further. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it discusses the story of Moses on the mountain. And God says to Moses, your people worship the golden calf. And Moses hears God telling him that. God is pretty reliable. And Moses certainly believed everything God told him. And still, he takes the tablets, goes down the mountain with the tablets intact, and when he sees the people worshiping the golden calf, he can't tolerate it, and he takes the tablets and throws them down and shatters them. So the question the Talmud asks, why didn't he shatter the tablets as soon as he got them when he knew that they worshiped the golden calf? He had a reason for shattering the tablets, which we won't go into, but if he had a reason for it, he should have done it before. The answer is, it's not the same thing when you see it with your own eyes as when you hear it, even if you hear it from the most reliable source. And of course, God is the most reliable source. But still, he didn't see it, so it doesn't become a part of his consciousness. It's not part of his psyche. When he sees it, it's an indelible part of his very being, and it has the effect that it had, that he couldn't tolerate it, and he threw the tablets down and shattered them. So that is the idea that it's not enough to have understanding the difference between day and night. You also have to open your eyes. You have to try to visualize it. You have to try to see that what is right is good and proper and should be followed. What is wrong is darkness and night and should not be followed, should be rejected. So yes, understanding is very important. And in fact, it's more fundamental than seeing, because before a person could visualize something, we're not talking about physical seeing in this case, good and evil, we're talking about intellectual sight, but before you could see something, you first have to hear it and understand it. So that's why this blessing follows the one before, which talked about understanding. So the understanding is the foundation, and then we go to the next level of visualizing and seeing. Let's go a little bit deeper. What is seeing? Well, there's an expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words, or something like that. It's the most inaccurate statement I've ever heard. A picture could be the most distorted understanding of what it is that is being depicted, and is inferior to not knowing anything about the subject. Because if the picture is not a complete picture, and by definition, there cannot be a complete picture, as I'll soon explain. So every picture is a distortion of reality. A picture, seeing, is not reality, the way we see things. Let me try to explain. I'll use an example from actual life. A number of years ago, all of the international media published a picture of a Palestinian youth throwing or attempting to throw a little rock at a whole group of Israeli soldiers. Some of them, there was a tank and heavily armed Israeli soldiers. And this picture sent all over the world by the AP and others, and it depicted a Goliath, Israel, pitted against this poor little David, Palestinian youth who only had a little pebble in his hand. Well, that picture is pretty convincing. If they would have just written, Palestinian youth throws rock at a tank, it would have just gone over the heads of most people. No one would have really been affected by it. This affected people profoundly. Then I saw a wider view of the same picture, but a little wider, that encompassed more area, that was published in Jewish newspapers. The other newspapers wouldn't publish it. In the wider view, you had about 20 photojournalists crouching, taking a picture of this event. It was a staged event. The media staged this, got a Palestinian youth, told him to hold a rock in his hand, to go to a place where there's an Israeli tank and Israeli soldiers. So the picture was the very opposite of what was the reality. The reality was that the photographers, that the media were inciting people against Israel. That using their power of their picture, their distorted picture. A picture doesn't really show you, visualizing things doesn't really give you the whole picture. Again, another example. You're blindfolded and brought into a room and you see a masked person holding a knife ready to stab someone who's tied and cannot move. Your first impression is that this is a murderer trying to kill someone, until you're told, no, this is the surgeon who's performing life-saving surgery on this hapless individual. But what happened over here? Your eyes saw, they didn't deceive you, yet you only saw one slice of that picture. You didn't see the whole picture. You don't have the context. Visualizing something without context is inferior to hearing something. Because when you hear something, you know you can't see the whole thing. Hearing, by definition, is piecemeal. When you hear a lecture, you hear one sentence, then the next sentence. Obviously, after the second sentence, you still don't know what the speaker is going to say. You only know a little bit of it. You have to hear another sentence. So, by definition, hearing is a construction of many bits of information that you put together. So you don't need the context, because you're not ready to draw any conclusions based on hearing only part of it. But a picture shows you the whole thing, but it doesn't. It only shows you one slice, and you cannot really understand what the picture is showing unless you see a much wider scope. That's just in terms of the context. And then you don't see the deeper layers, you only see the surface. The Talmud says, this is based on biblical phrases, that Jewish leaders, true Jewish leaders, are called the eyes of the community. Why are they called the eyes of the community? I'll give you an example of the Talmud. Tragic period in Jewish history was the Herodian period. King Herod, who rebuilt the temple. Sounds like he was a nice guy. He rebuilds the temple. But what caused him to rebuild the temple was that he was suspicious of the rabbis, so he massacred all the rabbis. And he blinded one surviving rabbi because he needed a smart guy to be his advisor. And he tried to test to see his loyalty, and he couldn't catch him. He couldn't trip him up. And he regretted, I put regretted in quotation marks, the massacre of all the rabbis, because look what he lost. He could have had such smart, loyal people. So he asked this rabbi, what can I do to atone for my sin? And the rabbi said, you blinded the light of the world. And it had a double meaning. Number one, you massacred all these rabbis, and they're the light, they're the eyes of the world. And he was referring also to his own vision and light that was blinded, his own eyes. And therefore, we build the temple, which is also called the eyes of the world. Now, why is the temple called the eyes, or the light of the world? Light and eyes are used interchangeably very often. Because the temple was a place where people came to see. You saw God, you perceived God. God saw you, and you saw God. That's what leaders, true leaders are. They're visionaries. They see things. They see things the way the things really are. Perhaps a simple analogy would be, you're standing on a mountain and you could see a much wider area, much wider expanse. So you really know what's going on, as opposed to people who are down on the earth. They don't know as much what's going on next door to them as the one who's on a higher perch. I remember when people were talking about the Soviet Jews, and people were saying, well, the Soviet Jews say this and they say that. And the response to that was, they don't know what's going on. They don't know what the government is doing. They don't know what's going on even in the next door neighbor. Everything is a secret. People on the outside have a better vision of what's going on in that type of a society. So the leaders are people who are capable of seeing the needs of the people in ways that the people themselves might not just might not, but certainly do not understand and appreciate. And sometimes the great leaders like Moses and all the other great leaders throughout history would say things and do things that the average person would say, why is he doing that? Because he doesn't see the way the leader sees it. So that's why the temple and the leaders are both referred to as eyes. God's eyes. They see things through godly eyes. That means that they have the ability to see things in context. There's a statement in the Talmud, who is wise? In Ethics of the Fathers, the answer is, who learns from everybody. That's an ethical approach to wisdom. A person who learns from everybody shows his humility and shows that he's not single-minded, he's open to other ideas, so he's much more capable of developing true wisdom. But that's the answer in Ethics of the Fathers. The answer in the Talmud, Alexander the Great asked this question of the rabbis, I believe, and they said, a wise person is the one who sees the future. Now, the Hebrew word for future is nolad, which means born, who sees that which will be born. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, translates it in a deeper way. Who is wise? Someone who sees the true godly nature that is the creative power in everything. That's the ultimate vision, when you could see not just the things in context, things the way they are when you see the whole picture, but you see the inner meaning of everything. You see the essence of everything, that it's divine energy that creates everything. When you see God's hand in everything, that's when you're really a wise person. That's when you really have your eyes. It says, HaChacham, the wise person has his eyes in his head. And the Zohar says, what about everyone else? But there's a deeper meaning to that. One of the meanings is that the Chacham really has true vision. He sees things not in the distorted way. And so when we ask God, open our eyes, we're not just talking about open our eyes so that we see physically. Not just that we see things, we see the difference between good and evil, which is great. But we can see everything in a different light. We see the pneumius, the inner dimension, the inner life of everything. When God created the world on the very first day, he created light. When did he create the sun, the moon, and the stars? On the fourth day. So the obvious question is, what light was there on the first day? One of the answers given in the Talmud, Midrash, Rashi, many other sources, is that on the first day of creation, God created a different kind of light. It was not sunlight. It was a spiritual light, but also a physical light that enabled a person to see from one end of the world to the other end of the world. Besides the fact that this was today we have television. You could see from one end of the world to the other end through cameras, electronically. Well, God doesn't need electronics. I'm sure that we're just in the beginning of the technological era. If you project another few hundred years ahead, we'll be laughing. They'll be digging up cameras and television. They'll be laughing at that antiquated technology to see from one end of the world to the other. But God created that ability to see from one end of the world to the other. But it's not just a physical vision. It was the true spiritual vision, to be able to see reality the way it really is. And what happened to that light? God says, I don't want the wicked to have power, access to this power. So he concealed it. And where did he conceal it? In the Torah. That when you study Torah, it gives you a little bit, a glimmer of that light, of that vision, to be able to see things in context, see the subtext, see the inner dimension of things. That's why Jewish leaders were only worthy of that title if their whole existence was steeped in Torah knowledge, because that's what gave them the vision. That's what gave them the ability to see things the way they really are. Rabbi Meir, one of the Talmudic sages, the word Meir means to give light. And it says in the Talmud that in his Torah scroll, he was a scribe, he wrote one word, he spelled it not the way we spell it. In the very beginning of Genesis, the Torah says that God gave Adam, after he recognized that he was naked, and he was sensitive to that, he gave him a garment, a cloak of or. Or in Hebrew means skin or leather or hide. It could be spelled with the letter ayin, vav, resh, then it means hide. Or it could be spelled aleph, vav, resh. Almost identical. Phonetically, it sounds the same. There are people who pronounce ayin a little different than they pronounce the aleph, but it's hardly discernible. What does the word or mean with an aleph? It means light. What's the difference between light and a hide? And in Rameir's Torah, instead of spelling it with an ayin to mean hide, he spells it with an aleph to mean light. That God gave them a garment of light. So what does that mean? That in his Torah it was spelled differently. Now, it's interesting. The Hebrew word for skin or hide, or, is spelled ayin, vav, resh. In the Torah there are no vowels. You could also read that iver, blind. So the way we have it in our Torah is that God gave Adam something that concealed. He took away the power of vision. Rabbi Meir, whose whole being was light, read it, God gave the potential for vision. That actually Adam was given, even though he had sinned and caused that original light should go away, he still had the ability to access some of that original vision. Just want to, as an aside, there's a tradition that when a person loses something and you can't find it, and it isn't totally lost or destroyed, but very often there are things that we lose in our homes and places that we have access to, but we can't find. There's a formula, it sounds like it's some type of magic, that you give tzedakah, you give charity, in the name and the merit of Rabbi Meir, Baal Hanes, the master of the miracle. And some say that that's referring to this Rabbi Meir. And some people even actually have a thing that they say, which says that we are all presumed blind, and that we are asking for this illumination to give us the ability to see things. I tried it at least 3 times, and it worked like a charm. I was shocked. I'll just share one story, maybe 2 stories. One story was I was looking for my car keys. For 2 weeks, I searched everywhere, and then I put $1 in the charity box. I had a went shopping. She came home, and she couldn't find her pocketbook. We searched the house, every nook and cranny of the house, and nowhere to be found. She went back to the store. Maybe she left it there. No, they didn't have it. And I gave up. A week later, my mother tells me that my sister had put money in the charity box and said this thing about Rabbi Meir. I said, okay, I'll look again. And I walk into the dining room where my mother never put her pocketbook. I open up a drawer, I see a pocketbook. I close the drawer and I open up the next drawer. I said, 1 sec, what did I just see? And it was a very powerful experience and that was the pocketbook. She never put it there. I would have never looked there. And even when I found it, I closed the shelf, not believing that I actually saw it. My eyes saw it, but it didn't register that was it until a few seconds later. Rabbi Meir, the word Meir is the symbol of this Torah vision that gives us the ability to see things because we are blind. I was looking at it, I saw it with my eyes, and yet I didn't see it. And that's what our lives are like. We see things, but we don't see things. We see miracles happening in front of us. The wars in Israel, every one of those wars, from the War of Independence through the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Lebanon Wars, the wars in Gaza. We should no longer have to have any of those wars, but in every one of those wars, yes, there were casualties, and that's tragic, and no one's trying to minimize them, but there were so many miracles happening, and they were noted. But the way the world just looks at them and it doesn't register because we are blind. And when we say this blessing, we're asking God, please open our eyes. But why 2 eyes? Why do we need 2 eyes? There's a story of the previous Lubavitcher Rabbi as a child. His father told him, you have 2 eyes. One eye, the right eye, is to see the beauty in another person, in another Jew. The left eye is to look at a candy. Yeah. Without any excitement. In other words, the positive eye, we look at things, right and left over here is metaphoric. We look at things with right eyes and left eyes. A right eye is positive look at things. You see someone doing something good, you say, look at a wonderful person. If you look at the person with the left eye, you say, he's showing off. Same thing. 2 people look at the same thing. One sees the good and one sees the negative. That's the right eye and the left eye. You always use the right eye, the positive, to see the good in others, and use the left eye, the critical eye, the negative eye, because we have to be critical sometimes. Use that for things that are not important. Be more critical of those things. Another variation of that is that when you're dealing with criticism, which is something that you have to have criticism when something is wrong, apply most of the criticism to yourself. When it comes on judging someone favorably, don't be so favorable to yourself when you judge yourself. Don't knock yourself beyond what you have to. You should know your own qualities and your own strengths. But if you have to be very critical, use the criticism for yourself. See the flaws in yourself so you could correct them, but see the good in the others. So you have 2 eyes. There are 2. When we ask God to open our eyes, what we're asking for is not just open our eyes so we see things, but we know how to see things. Sometimes you have to see things in a positive vein. Sometimes you have to see things in a negative vein. You should know how to do it. Another example of this would be Bilam the heathen prophet. It says that he was blind in one eye. And Hasidic commentators explain what that means, figuratively speaking, that we have 2 eyes. One eye is to see the greatness of God. The other eye is to see our own limits. Bilam was very good at seeing the greatness of God. He was a prophet. He had a good relationship, awareness of God, but most people who are close to God makes them humble. He became more arrogant. God is speaking to me. I must be something special. So he had one eye that was working very well. The other eye was not. So we have 2 eyes. One eye we have to see the greatness of God, the goodness of others. The other eye we have to see our own limits, our own deficiencies, our own shortcomings. At any rate, the blessing to open our eyes is about seeing things on different levels and seeing things with much clearer vision. In general, there are many sources in the Midrash that apply this blessing to the future. Our own land, because that's not necessarily true for 6 million, 7 million Jews. They are in Israel. But they, as well as we, are still in exile, alienated from the presence of God in the world that was channeled through the Holy Temple. When that is revealed the way is intended to be, the whole world is shrouded in an aura of holiness and of goodness, and there's no more war, and there'll be universal peace. That's the Messianic age. Right now, we don't see things. The darkness of exile. Exile is likened to night, biblically and talmudically, midrashically, especially in mystical teachings. So in the night, where our eyes are closed, our eyes are wide open, but yet we don't see. And that's what we're asking God. Even as we're thanking Him for our vision, we're saying, this vision that we have today, whatever level of vision, it's but a small sample of the vision that we're really looking forward in the future. In the first blessing, we spoke about the difference between day and night. We're recognizing that there's a difference between today, which is night, and the future, which is day. In the second blessing, we're describing what is the difference. The difference is that then we will really have true vision. Our eyes will see the way I described what true vision is before. And there's another interesting midrash that of all the different types of infirmity that will be cured in the Messianic age, the first thing that will be cured will be vision. Physically speaking, that those who are blind will begin to see before all the other. I don't know what the time lapse will be between one and another, but vision will be the first thing. Why is that? Why is vision? Because that's the first spiritual thing that will change. The physical is a manifestation of the spiritual. The first thing that will change is people will see God, they'll see one another. You know, when the plague of darkness was the penultimate plague in Egypt, what does it say in the Torah? It was dark, and one person could not see his brother. What does that mean? It means we're also in a state where people don't see the plight of their brother. They're not sensitive. They don't see what is going on with their fellow. They don't see what's going on in the world. They're oblivious to what's going on. The first thing that will be healed is our vision, our spiritual vision, which will also manifest itself in our physical vision being reinstated. But of course, all the other things will also come around, will be healed entirely. The deaf will be able to hear. Those who can't walk will be able to walk, and so on and so forth. One other thing about vision is that sometimes vision is not, the absence of vision is blindness. Sometimes the absence of vision is just a lower level. We've been learning Torah. Torah has been taught from Moses down. When Mashiach will come, he will teach Torah to everyone, including Moses. But his manner of teaching will be different. It won't be audio, it'll be visual. What that means, if you want to use an analogy, if I have to describe a piece of art, let's say I'm an art professor and I'm giving a lecture on some great artist, and I describe the Mona Lisa. We don't have a copy of it. I'm just describing it orally. You know, you can do, a person who knows a lot about art could go through the whole painting and say about the different features. It'll take, let's say, a 2-hour lecture till they go through everything But if I just bring in the Mona Lisa, everyone sees it in one instant. Now, they might see it, but they may not appreciate what they're seeing. For that, you need the lecture. In the former case, you need the lecture just to get the information, and it can take hours. In the latter case, when you see the picture, you have everything at once. Then you need someone to explain what you've seen. Well, the same way, now that when we study Torah, even when we read with our eyes, we're getting information in a piecemeal way. It takes time until we put everything together, until we absorb it. Mashiach will teach Torah in a manner, I don't mean visual, that he'll be on TV. He will teach it to us in a way that we'll see the whole picture. And therefore, the greatest scholar and the most simple person will see the same thing, though they will have different levels of appreciating what they're seeing. That's the level of Torah study that will be revealed in the future. And that's when we ask God, open our eyes. We mean not just to take us away from blindness, but to see things in ways that we could never see them before. And that will be the ultimate level of Torah study. So that covers this second blessing of opening the eyes. Have a good evening, and God willing, we will continue the series probably next Tuesday night, the night before Sukkot. Yeah, we can probably do it then. Okay, thank you for participating.
We done?